Starting a new job always feels a bit more structured than I expect it to be, even when I've done it before. There's a rhythm to it that doesn't really change from place to place. You walk in, someone greets you, you're handed forms, you're shown where to sit, and for a while you just follow instructions without needing to think too much about anything else. That's how this one started, too. Nothing about the first day stood out in a dramatic way. It was mostly introductions that felt slightly rehearsed, like everyone already had a mental template for how this process should go. Names, roles, brief explanations of responsibilities. I remember nodding a lot more than speaking, partly because there wasn't much to add yet, and partly because that's usually how these early hours work. You're not expected to define anything, just fit into what's already defined. The office itself felt familiar in the way most offices do. People moving with purpose, but not urgency. Conversations happening in small clusters. Computers already set up, systems already running, workflows already in motion long before I arrived. I was shown my space, given access details, and walked through a few basic systems. Nothing unusual, the kind of onboarding that doesn't really ask anything of you except attention. What I noticed more than anything was how quickly people assign meaning to your presence. Not in an obvious way. No one says it directly. It's more in the tone of how they speak, the assumptions built into explanations, the way instructions are framed as if your position is already fully understood by everyone else. There's a kind of quiet labeling that happens early. You don't notice it at first because it feels natural. Someone explains something to you like you're new, someone else corrects something like you're temporary, and someone else assigns you a task like you've already been fully placed into the system. And you just go along with it, because that's what you're supposed to do on a first day. I remember sitting through one of those early briefings and realizing I hadn't actually been asked anything that required context from me. Everything was being directed toward me, not shaped with me. That's normal in onboarding, but it also says something about how roles are assumed before they're ever tested. No one asked about how I preferred to work. No one needed to. At least not yet. There was a kind of quiet confidence in the structure itself. Like everything was already accounted for, already mapped out, already functioning. My presence wasn't something that would change the system, it was something that would be absorbed into it. I didn't resist that. I didn't really respond to it either. I just observed it. Because that's usually what the beginning of a place is. Observation disguised as participation. At one point, someone explained a reporting line to me, pointing out who handled what, who approved what, and where things eventually ended up. It was all straightforward. Standard hierarchy. The kind you see in most companies where structure matters more than personality. I remember thinking how easily people trust visible structure. Titles, positions, who sits where, who speaks first in meetings. It all becomes a shortcut for understanding authority. But shortcuts only work when the full picture is already visible. What no one in that room needed to consider was that not every structure is fully visible to the people operating inside it. Some parts of it exist outside the assumptions being made in that moment, quietly unaffected by how things appear on the surface. I didn't say that out loud. There was no reason to. Nothing about the situation required correction. So I just continued the day like everyone expected me to. Took notes when needed, followed instructions when given, responded when spoken to. The normal rhythm of someone stepping into a system that already believes it understands itself completely. But underneath that normal rhythm, there was a quiet awareness I didn't engage with directly. Not urgency. Not conflict. Just clarity forming slowly in the background. Because sometimes the most important thing you notice on a first day isn't what you're being told. It's what everyone else assumes is already true, before you've even had the chance to define anything yourself. And in this case, those assumptions were already in place long before I walked in. What stayed with me after that first day wasn't anything specific that was said, but how quickly things started to settle into place around me. By the second or third day, people already weren't treating me like someone they were still figuring out. It was more like I had been placed into a category that didn't need revisiting. That's something I've noticed in most workplaces, but it feels more visible when you're paying attention to it instead of just moving through it. Roles get assigned fast, not formally at first, but socially. Someone decides, usually without saying it out loud, what level of input you're expected to have, how much your opinion matters, how much responsibility you can touch without needing permission. And once that impression forms, it tends to stick unless something forces it to change. In meetings, I started noticing how naturally people leaned into that structure. Certain voices carried weight without needing to assert it. Others filled silence without expecting it to lead anywhere. I was placed somewhere in the middle of that without anyone explicitly saying so, which is how most people are placed when they're new. There's a kind of efficiency in it. The system doesn't pause to verify assumptions about people because it doesn't have time to. It just builds a working model of you and moves on. What was interesting to me was how consistent that model became across different interactions. In one conversation, I was given instructions as if I was executing a predefined role. In another, I was asked for input, but only within narrow limits that had already been decided. In both cases, there was no sense that my position was open to interpretation. It was already understood by everyone else in the room. Even the way I was introduced to people felt fixed. Titles were repeated, explanations were brief, and context was minimal. Not because people were hiding anything, but because they didn't think anything needed expanding. That's where the subtle tension starts to form, even if nobody around you is aware of it. Because I was listening to all of it, while also being aware of something else underneath it. The fact that none of these interpretations had anything to do with the full structure of what was actually in place. But I didn't correct it. There was no need to. Correcting assumptions in environments like this isn't usually immediate anyway. People don't respond to information first. They respond to disruption. And nothing had been disrupted yet. So, I stayed in the rhythm. Attended the meetings, followed the instructions, let the system continue building its version of what I was. At one point, someone explained a decision-making process to me in a way that assumed final authority sat entirely within a visible chain of management. It was described casually, like a fact that didn't need questioning. Everyone around the table nodded as if it was already understood. I remember thinking how often systems feel complete to the people operating inside them, even when they're only seeing the parts that are meant to be visible. It wasn't incorrect from their perspective, it was just incomplete. And that gap between what is assumed and what actually exists was still quiet enough that nobody was looking at it directly. What made it more interesting was how naturally people adjusted their behavior around that assumption. Not just in what they said, but in what they didn't ask. There were things nobody needed clarification on, because the hierarchy, as they understood it, already answered those questions in advance. I started noticing small patterns in how trust was distributed, not evenly, not consciously, but through repetition. Certain approvals didn't need explanation. Certain instructions didn't need justification. Certain people didn't need to be questioned at all. And I was being absorbed into that system in real time. The strange part is that none of it felt wrong. It felt normal. Functional. The kind of structure that holds most workplaces together without anyone having to think about it too deeply. But underneath that normality, there was a slow awareness forming. Not of conflict, but of timing. Because systems like this don't usually react to truth immediately. They react when truth interrupts expectation. And I was starting to wonder, quietly, how long it would take before anything in their assumptions had to adjust. Not because I wanted it to happen, but because I could already see that nothing in the current structure was built to account for it. I've learned over time that most people inside a company don't actually interact with ownership in any direct way. They interact with management, with policies, with procedures, with whatever structure has been built to translate ownership into something operational. And because of that distance, it becomes easy for people to assume that what they see is the full system. In reality, it usually isn't. Ownership sits in a different layer. It doesn't need to appear in daily workflow for the system to function. In private companies especially, those layers can stay completely invisible to employees for years. You can work under a structure without ever needing to think about who ultimately holds control over it. A 51% stake, in practical terms, is not something that shows itself in everyday interactions. It doesn't speak in meetings, it doesn't assign tasks, it doesn't need to. It exists through governance, through voting rights, board composition, and the legal framework that defines what the company is allowed to do when decisions actually matter. Most people never see that part of the system. And they don't need to, until something forces it into view. Board authority, employment agreements, shareholder arrangements, these are not things that come up in normal workplace conversation. They sit behind everything else, only becoming relevant when decisions escalate beyond routine operations. What I've noticed is that the further you are from that layer, the more stable the surface appears. People operate confidently inside what they believe is the complete structure. They make decisions, assign responsibility, and interpret hierarchy based on what is visible to them. And in most cases, that works well enough that no one questions it. That gap between visible structure and actual structure is usually harmless. It only becomes important when assumptions are challenged by something that doesn't fit the expected model. My position in all of this was never meant to be loud or visible. I didn't enter the company to signal anything. There was no need for announcement or recognition beyond what was necessary for legal and operational function. The decision to take a normal employee role was intentional, but not emotional. It was practical. There's a difference between being present in a system and being known by it. Being known changes behavior. People adjust when they know what someone represents. But being present without that recognition allows you to see how the system behaves when it thinks it understands everything already. That was the point of it. Not interference, not disruption, just observation. It's easy to forget how much of workplace behavior is shaped by assumptions about where authority sits. Most employees never verify ownership structure because they don't need to. Managers rarely question it because it's outside their functional responsibility. Even senior staff often operate entirely within a framework that feels complete from their perspective, and so the system continues smoothly, built on what is visible rather than what is foundational. In environments like this, control is rarely felt directly. It's distributed through rules, approvals, and delegated authority. That's what makes it effective. It doesn't rely on constant attention from the top layer. It just requires that the structure beneath it is understood and accepted. I was aware of that separation the entire time. There's a calmness that comes from understanding how something is structured at that level. Not because it gives emotional advantage, but because it removes confusion. You stop interpreting surface behavior as if it defines the full reality. At no point did I feel the need to correct how people perceived things. That was never the objective. People were working with the information available to them, and in most cases, that's all anyone can do inside a functioning system. But I also knew something else. When a system is built on assumptions about control, those assumptions only hold as long as they remain untested, and in most workplaces, they are never tested at all. That's what makes the structure stable, and also what makes it fragile in ways nobody thinks about in advance. So I stayed in the role. Not hiding, not performing anything different from what was expected. Just occupying the space that had been assigned on paper while being fully aware of the structure underneath it. And over time, that separation between perception and reality became less theoretical and more observable. Not in dramatic ways, in small ones. In how decisions were framed, in how authority was assumed, in how rarely anyone looked beyond the layer directly in front of them. And that was enough to understand something important without needing to act on it yet. Most systems don't fail because people are wrong. They fail because no one realizes they were only seeing part of the structure in the first place. What started to stand out to me over the following days wasn't anything dramatic or unusual on its own. It was just repetition. The same way decisions were passed down. The same way instructions were framed. The same way responsibility always seemed to originate from the same visible group of people, no matter what the underlying structure actually allowed. In most meetings, there was a natural flow to how things moved. Someone would set direction, someone else would refine it, and then tasks would be distributed as if the source of authority was already settled. No one questioned where that authority was coming from, because it didn't need to be questioned in their day-to-day work. And that, more than anything else, was what defined the environment. Not certainty in the formal sense, but certainty in perception. Managers spoke in a way that assumed continuity, as if their role didn't just organize work, but also defined its limits. When they assigned tasks, there was an expectation built into the tone itself that the structure they were operating in was complete and final. No gaps, no unseen layers, just a direct line from decision to execution. I noticed it most in the smaller exchanges. A brief instruction given without checking whether it aligned with anything beyond the immediate chain. A comment about priorities made as if those priorities existed independently of any broader structure. A correction delivered casually, as though approval had already been implicitly granted somewhere above. None of it was aggressive. None of it was unusual. In fact, it was exactly how most workplaces function when everything feels stable. But stability, in this case, was based on something unspoken. There were moments where decisions were made and simply carried forward without hesitation. Not because they were verified, but because the system around them assumed they were already valid. That assumption didn't feel risky to anyone involved because it had never been challenged, and I stayed in that space quietly, not interrupting it. Part of what makes environments like this so consistent is how quickly they self-organize around visible leadership. People naturally align themselves with whoever appears to be the decision point. It reduces uncertainty. It makes communication simpler. It avoids unnecessary friction. But it also compresses the structure into something smaller than what actually exists. I started noticing how rarely anyone looked beyond that visible layer. Not out of negligence, but out of efficiency. If someone appears to have authority and consistently exercises it, there's usually no incentive to question where that authority ultimately originates. Even when decisions had broader implications, they still traveled through the same familiar channels. The same names, the same approvals, the same assumptions about who needed to be consulted and who didn't. There were small moments that stood out more than the rest. A decision being framed as final when it technically wasn't. A conversation where someone assumed alignment without confirming it. A casual reference to how things are done here that didn't account for anything outside the immediate operational layer. Each of these moments was minor on its own, easily ignored, easily explained as normal workplace flow. But together, they formed a pattern, not of dysfunction, but of assumption. The system wasn't breaking. It was operating exactly as designed from the perspective of those inside it. That was the important part. Nothing felt wrong to them because nothing in their experience required them to see beyond what was directly in front of them. And I didn't correct any of it. There was no reason to. Correcting assumptions in real time usually changes the dynamic faster than people can process. It creates reactions that aren't about truth, but about disruption. And at this stage, there was no need to introduce either. So I observed instead. Not with judgment, and not with urgency, just with awareness of how consistently authority was being interpreted through visibility rather than structure. Over time, that started to reveal something important. It wasn't that people were making incorrect decisions. It was that they were making complete decisions based on incomplete visibility of control. And in most cases, that difference doesn't matter, until it suddenly does. What I was seeing wasn't conflict. It wasn't tension in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, a system fully functioning inside a version of itself that had never been tested against its own underlying assumptions. And the longer I stayed in that environment, the more visible that gap became. Not through anything changing, but through the consistency of how little it was ever questioned. It didn't happen in a dramatic way. There was no build-up that felt like something was about to break, no warning signs that stood out in the moment. It was just a normal part of the day that shifted slightly in tone, the way small administrative decisions sometimes do when they carry more weight than they first appear to. I was called into a short meeting. Nothing about it felt unusual at first. These kinds of meetings happen in any onboarding environment: quick check-ins, early feedback, adjustments to role expectations. I'd seen enough workplaces to know that not every meeting signals a problem. The room itself was ordinary. Same kind of setup as the others. Neutral lighting, standard seating, documents already prepared. People who had the calm, practiced tone of individuals delivering something they had likely already discussed before I walked in. The conversation was direct, but not personal. They explained that after reviewing initial fit, the decision had been made to end the employment arrangement effective immediately. The language was structured, careful in the way these decisions usually are. It wasn't framed as emotional or controversial, it was framed as procedure. Performance, alignment, early assessment. Standard terms that reduce something final into something administrative. I remember listening without interrupting. Not because I agreed or disagreed, but because the way it was being delivered didn't require a response in their framing of it. It was already decided. My presence in the room was just part of the closure process. There's a specific kind of clarity that comes in moments like that. Not emotional clarity, but structural clarity. I understood exactly what was happening in their system. From their perspective, this was a clean decision. A short employment cycle, resolved early, no complications, no escalation. It fit within their internal logic completely. What stood out wasn't the decision itself, it was how normal it felt to them. No hesitation, no visible uncertainty, no awareness that anything outside their immediate framework might even be relevant. They were operating entirely within the assumption that they had full authority over the situation in front of them. That assumption wasn't spoken, it was embedded in the way the conversation moved, in how finality was delivered, in how no further layers of consideration were acknowledged. I didn't challenge it in the moment. There was no raised voice, no attempt to correct or redirect the conversation. That wasn't necessary at that stage. The interaction had already been completed from their point of view before it even reached me. So I just processed it internally, quietly, in real time. What I found interesting wasn't the termination itself. It was the separation between what they believed they were doing and what the structure actually allowed. Because what they were treating as a complete action, final, closed, resolved, was only complete within a single layer of the system. They were making a decision about employment, not realizing that employment was only one part of a much larger structure that existed above and beyond their operational authority. But none of that surfaced in the room. And it didn't need to. I remember standing up at the end of the meeting in the same way you would after any procedural discussion. There was no point in forcing the situation into confrontation. The system had already completed its action according to its own rules. Walking out of the room felt normal on the surface, the kind of normal that most people would recognize without thinking twice about it. But internally, there was a different kind of recognition forming. Not anger, not surprise, just alignment of information. Because the interesting part wasn't that I had been removed from a role. It was that the system had just executed a decision assuming it had full control over something it only partially understood. And that gap between assumed authority and actual structure was now no longer theoretical. It had just been demonstrated in real time, without anyone in that room realizing it. After I left the room, nothing around me changed in the way people might expect after something like that. There was no visible disruption, no immediate correction, no sense that the system itself had paused to reconsider what had just happened. Everything continued in the same rhythm it had before, emails being sent, conversations continuing in low tones, people moving between tasks as if the day had not been interrupted at all. That part stayed with me more than anything else. Not the decision itself, but how quickly it disappeared into the normal flow of operations. By the time I had stepped out of the building, the interaction already felt sealed off from the rest of the environment. Not resolved in a meaningful way, just categorized. Filed away under something that no longer required attention. I didn't receive any follow-up that day. No clarification. No adjustment. No indication that anyone was reconsidering what had taken place. The message was implicit, even if it was never directly stated. The process was complete. And from their perspective, it probably was. That's what made the silence so noticeable. Not emptiness, but continuation. The company didn't stop functioning. It didn't slow down. It didn't appear to register that anything structurally important might have just shifted. Internally, the decision had already been absorbed into their system as final. The kind of final that doesn't leave space for reinterpretation. I didn't reach out. Not because I was avoiding anything emotional, but because there was nothing in the situation that required immediate reaction from my side. The structure they were operating within had already defined the outcome in their terms. What I found myself paying attention to instead was how quickly institutions normalize their own conclusions. A decision gets made, a status gets updated, a person is moved out of a workflow, and then, almost immediately, the system behaves as if that version of reality has always been the only one that mattered. There's a kind of efficiency in that process. It allows things to continue without friction, but it also depends entirely on the assumption that all relevant information has already been accounted for at the moment of decision. In this case, it hadn't. Not in a way they were aware of. That gap remained unspoken. But it was present in how cleanly everything proceeded afterward. Clean decisions often rely on incomplete visibility. They feel final only because the parts outside the frame haven't been acknowledged yet. I remember sitting with that thought more than any emotional reaction. Not frustration, not urgency, just awareness of how systems behave when they believe they've closed a loop that is still technically open. From their side, there was no reason to revisit anything. The interaction had followed procedure. The outcome aligned with internal expectations. Nothing in their immediate experience suggested otherwise. So they moved forward. And I stayed out of the flow entirely, not intervening, not correcting, not introducing anything new into their understanding. That silence created something unusual. Not tension in the obvious sense, but distance, a separation between what they believed had been concluded and what actually existed beneath that conclusion. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was just there, in the background, growing more defined with every moment they continued operating as if the situation had fully resolved itself. What struck me most was how little awareness was required for that kind of continuation. No one had to consciously ignore anything. They simply didn't have access to the part of the structure that made further consideration necessary. And so, they didn't consider it. That's how most systems function when they believe they've reached closure. They move forward on the assumption that no missing information exists, because nothing has forced them to look for it. I didn't interrupt that process. There was no need to. Silence, in situations like this, isn't passive. It carries information that only becomes visible once the system tries to rely on its assumptions again. And at this stage, all I could see clearly was how confidently the organization had moved on from something it hadn't fully understood yet. Not out of negligence, but because, from their point of view, there was nothing left to understand. After a few days of silence, my focus naturally shifted away from the moment itself and toward what it meant inside the structure they were operating. Not emotionally. Practically. There's a difference between experiencing a decision and understanding how that decision sits within a system. Once the immediate procedural layer is gone, meetings, explanations, formal language, you're left with how the organization continues to behave when it believes the situation is already resolved. That was what I started paying attention to. The first thing I did wasn't reactive. I didn't reach out to challenge anything or introduce pressure into the situation. Instead, I went back to documentation, the kind that usually sits in the background of a company's operations without being actively referenced day to day. Shareholding records, internal governance structure, board composition, formal agreements that define what authority actually means when it moves beyond employment and into control. It wasn't about discovering anything new. It was about recentering what already existed on paper, separate from how people were interpreting the situation internally. What I noticed, more than anything, was how disconnected day-to-day perception can become from structural reality when no one has reason to question it. Inside most operational environments, authority is experienced socially before it is understood legally. People respond to presence, titles, and routine decision flow. Over time, that becomes the default model of how control is assumed to work. But assumptions don't change legal structure. They only shape behavior around it. I didn't announce anything immediately. There was no need to interrupt the existing rhythm of the organization while it was still processing its own version of closure. Instead, I allowed a small amount of time to pass while I prepared a clear, factual clarification of position. Not framed emotionally. Not framed as conflict, just as correction of structure. When I eventually communicated, it was brief and direct. Nothing about tone needed emphasis. The content itself carried the weight. The response, at least initially, reflected what I expected, but only partially. There was a delay before acknowledgement, not silence in the earlier sense, but a different kind of pause. The kind that happens when internal systems try to reconcile two versions of reality that don't align easily. At first, the replies were cautious, neutral phrasing, requests for clarification, references to internal processes that didn't fully account for the information now being introduced. It wasn't resistance in an aggressive sense. It was more like recalibration under uncertainty. What stood out was how quickly informal authority began to shift. People who had been making decisions comfortably within an assumed hierarchy started to slow down their responses, not because they were told to, but because the foundation they were relying on no longer felt fully stable. That's something most organizations don't notice immediately, the difference between formal structure and perceived structure. When those two align, everything feels smooth. When they don't, even routine communication starts to carry hesitation. I didn't escalate anything. I didn't need to. The information itself was sufficient to change how the system responded, and I stayed in observation mode throughout it, not watching for reaction in a personal sense, but for how the organization adjusted when its assumptions were no longer fully reliable. Some conversations became more formal. Others were redirected upward. A few decisions that were previously treated as settled were quietly reopened for review. None of this was dramatic on the surface. It was procedural in appearance, but structurally significant underneath. What I found interesting was how quickly people adapt when the model they've been using to interpret authority is no longer consistent. No confrontation was required. Only correction. And once that correction existed in the system, everything else began to reorganize around it at its own pace. I stayed deliberate about not introducing emotion into that process, not because emotion wasn't present, but because it wasn't useful in that context. Systems don't respond to emotional framing in a stable way. They respond to structure, documentation, and clarity of position. So I allowed those elements to speak for themselves. Over time, what had initially been treated as a closed outcome began to behave differently inside their internal environment. Not reversed, not challenged, simply reclassified under information that required adjustment. And through all of it, I didn't push. I only made sure that what was already true on paper was finally being seen in practice. What happened next wasn't a turning point in the way people usually imagine these situations. There was no single moment where everything snapped into place, no dramatic confrontation that reset the structure in an instant. Instead, it unfolded in a slower, more procedural way, through acknowledgments, corrections, and quiet internal reassessments that happened across different layers of the company at different speeds. At first, the responses I received were still cautious. Not resistant, but unsettled in a way that didn't fully show itself in the language being used. Messages were structured carefully. Questions were phrased to avoid assumptions. People were trying to confirm details without directly challenging what had already been stated. It was less about disagreement and more about recalculating what they thought they already understood. That phase didn't last long, but it was noticeable. Because once the underlying structure was verified internally, the tone began to shift. What had previously been treated as a completed decision started to get revisited, not emotionally, but administratively. The same systems that had processed my termination without hesitation now began to re-examine the scope of authority involved in making that decision in the first place. Nothing about it was loud. There were no public corrections, no visible conflict. It was all internal recalibration, documentation being reviewed again, authority lines being rechecked, assumptions being quietly updated. And in that process, something important became visible. It wasn't that anyone had acted with bad intent. It was that the system had operated entirely within a perceived boundary of control that had never been questioned at the moment the decision was made. That realization changed the tone of everything that followed. Meetings became more deliberate. Decisions that had already been considered closed were paused and reevaluated. Communication moved slightly higher up the chain, not because of instruction, but because of uncertainty about where final authority actually sat. It was not collapse. It was adjustment. And from my side, I stayed out of the emotional layer of it completely. There was no need to interpret it as conflict, and no value in treating it like a personal event. What mattered was not how it felt, but how accurately the structure was now being understood compared to how it had been assumed before. Over time, that gap closed. Slowly, but consistently. What had been misread as a standard employment decision was no longer being treated that way. The correction didn't require pressure. It only required clarity to remain present long enough to be fully absorbed into the system. Once that happened, the environment settled into a new equilibrium. Not one defined by disruption, but by alignment. People returned to their roles, but with a different awareness of where those roles actually sat within the broader structure. Conversations became more measured, not out of fear, but out of recalibrated understanding. The informal assumptions that had once guided behavior were replaced by something more cautious, more accurate. And through all of it, I didn't frame the outcome as something I had won. That wasn't the point, and it didn't feel like the right interpretation of what had happened. It was closer to correction than victory. Alignment rather than reversal. The system hadn't been forced to change direction. It had simply been shown where it was already misaligned. And once that became clear, everything else followed its natural order. Looking back at it, the most consistent pattern wasn't conflict or resistance. It was assumption. Assumptions about where authority begins and ends. Assumptions about what a decision means once it is made. Assumptions about who needs to be consulted and who doesn't. None of those assumptions matter until they meet a structure that doesn't match them. And when that happens, the system doesn't break in a dramatic way. It adjusts. Quietly, carefully, and often without acknowledging how close it came to being wrong in the first place. That was the real shift, not power changing hands, but perception finally catching up to structure. And in that space, everything became simpler. Not because anything was taken or given back, but because what was always true on paper was finally being reflected in how things actually worked. I didn't raise my voice. I corrected the structure. Power wasn't taken back, it was simply recognized. Most systems don't collapse from conflict. They collapse from missing information. The day they fired me, they didn't remove me from the company. They just revealed who was never supposed to be invisible